have at least one person online. So I want to welcome our friends online here. And as always, this will be available for Zoom. I'll send out the normal email with the outline for that week. It will also then be available on YouTube. So if you're not able to make it, or I know some of you you seasonally move to other places. So yeah, you snowbird. And I don't blame you for being here and not in Arizona right now. So right, yeah, exactly. That's why I don't blame you for not wanting to be there. All right. Well, we are in a study of Acts of the Apostles. Our plan is to finish the book and then to turn to the book of Hebrews. So that's sort of the itinerary that we're charting for this year. And I want to just kind of pick up basically where we left off. And I think actually I'll just start by putting the mic here for now. It's not on yet, so you can say things under your breath. You can still do that. So what I thought I would do, it's been several months since I left you in April. I know you had Jeff came in and did a really Herculean effort of for 3 weeks, I think, and then kind of landed the plane for a while. So we're going to start basically back where I stopped. And I figure one good thing to do would sort of to remind us a little bit of some of the things that we said about Acts at the very beginning of our time last fall, as a way just to kind of get the cobwebs out and sort of remember where we've been, et cetera, and hopefully where we're going. I didn't want to do the entirety of my intro comments, which I love to do those kind of things because it paints a big background. But it's also can be, if we're kind of repeating ourselves, not always as productive as we want. So I just really had a couple of things that I wanted to talk about. One is to, I don't know if you remember this, but we talked a little bit about the title of this book, the way that it has come down to us in the tradition. And of course, most of the books in the New Testament don't come with titles. They oftentimes are not explicitly named in terms of the authors. And of course, there were no chapter, verse numbers, et cetera, in terms of the original manuscripts. But in terms of the tradition, we've typically heard of Acts as Acts of the Apostles, right? That's the way it's typically come to us. And one of the things that I think we began to discover, I sort of certainly made this, tried to make this point at the very beginning of our time together. And that was that the central actor in the book of Acts, as it turns out, is not the apostles. It's who? Yeah, you can go ahead and grab that mic. Let's just start folding folks in here. Yes, you do, and we love it.
So this is on.
That's on.
You kept saying the Holy Spirit, the Holy Spirit, the Holy Spirit.
That's right. That's right. With the Holy Spirit, I think I have God here, God or the Spirit, God, the Spirit, Jesus. They turn out to be really the central characters, in a sense, or the primary agents. It's not that there is not other agency going on, from apostles to other church folks who encounter the apostles, et cetera. But the one that drives the story is God. And sometimes that means, actually, and this is one of the chapters that we are kind of just now leaving, the church itself, it finds the community finds themselves having to catch up with what God is trying to do, and even sometimes objecting to it. And I think that's one of the things that we see as we move our way into the discussion around Gentile inclusion, right? If everybody remembers, the early Christians are all Jewish. They understand Jesus as the fulfillment of God's promises to Israel. And perhaps that would, of course, include others, but they would have to potentially cross a threshold into becoming Jewish. Now, one of the things I tried to make clear and have done over time is that this is a big debate that's going on in the Jewish world in general. How do Jews relate to non-Jews? Can non-Jews participate in the life of Israel without becoming fully Jewish, etc.? So there's a Christian version, basically, of this argument going on. And Paul comes along in part because, and not only Paul, but Peter, because God pushes them in that direction. So this idea of the primary actor, the agent, being God and not the church or the apostles, I think is a really important one to keep in mind as we're reading through the text. And I think also an important one to keep in mind as we think about what this might have to say to us today. So as I mentioned here, right, the story of Acts essentially is of the ongoing work of God through the witness and work of ordinary people who are trying to follow Jesus together. And one of the things that you get, I think, in keeping with sort of the spirit of the Hebrew Bible, is that oftentimes we get pictures of the early community, warts and all. So we don't get a picture of an absolutely perfect or perfected community, let alone perfect or perfected apostles, per se, in our text. So this is really then about, as I say here, discipleship and life together. So that's a big sort of thematic piece, it seems to me, that's important. I'll come back to some, what I think are three big themes that we've already encountered and that we will continue to encounter as we move through. Just a couple of very kind of historical general observations. One is that the book of Acts is understood to be connected to the Gospel of Luke. I think it's pretty universally accepted in the scholarship, certainly in the history of the tradition of the church, that the same person that authored the Gospel of Luke also was responsible for Acts, and that in some sense, these two were seen to be, they were understood to be together, right? They belonged together. The first volume, of course, deals with, I'm in trouble here with my clicker for some reason, the life history of Jesus, right? And it's a gospel, basically. And we've talked in other classes about what is a gospel, which, as an aside, I think I've said is a sort of theological account of history, right? Of historical events or events that are rooted historically, with a theological interpretation of what's going on in those. And then that same sort of sensibility now is extended into the life of the Christian community as it's starting to grow, evolve, and networks of churches are basically developing, at least in this early period. Connections, without going into tons of detail, there are a lot of linguistic and other thematic connections. There is the very interesting connection of how Luke Acts treats the city of Jerusalem. In some ways, the whole of the Gospel of Luke flows up to Jerusalem, and the book of Acts flows out from Jerusalem. So there's all kinds of interesting ways that we see the connections of these two volumes together. And again, you can go back into your notes from our first weeks together if you want more details. What about sort of the dating, where this was written, the audience? The best guess dating, I think, is 80 to 90. So towards the end of the first century. Typically, this is rooted in the fact that the Gospel of Luke clearly borrows from the Gospel of Mark. So it has to be after that. And then there are some other factors that will oftentimes go into determining that time frame. Where we don't really know for sure, and this is sometimes an important question, because even though we encounter these books in some ways as timeless, they are not timeless, right? They are written in a particular time and place, and oftentimes the shaping of the story is meant to actually answer or engage some question or issue that's on the ground in a given community. So that sometimes is important. We don't really know, though, exactly where this text was produced, perhaps in Rome, perhaps in some of these regions here. Achaia is, I believe that's in Greece, and then the other area, Boeotia. Lastly, though, one thing that we do know, I think that we can feel relatively secure about is that this, like the Gospel of Luke, is primarily imagining a Gentile Christian audience. Not that there are not, Jewish Christians that would be interested, but there are so many place names, the use of language, idiomatic expressions that would have made more sense to a Gentile than to a Jew, that it just seems to add up to both the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts being aimed at that community. That also, of course, links into one of the big themes that we find in the book of Acts. And let me turn now then to the theme. So I have basically three themes. The first theme is one that we've already touched on, and that is the gift of the Spirit. I describe this here as the eschatological spirit because I'm an academic and I'm trying to put you to sleep before we get started in our time together. But that word eschatological simply, I think, is meant to highlight that whatever the folks in these stories are thinking about the Spirit, one thing for certain that they are thinking is that this is a new gift of God, and one that is somehow connected to the end of all things. And that's what the eschatology piece refers to. So this is a gift that's given. This is a reality that is engaging and has a very definite angling towards the eschatological. In this regard, two things I think can fit underneath our little discussion here of the eschatological spirit. The first is one that we've already made, right? The Spirit is a or the central actor, depending if we want to replace Spirit with God and Jesus. Other proposed titles that you will encounter, like if you were working, reading through a commentary or something, like maybe even if you're listening to a popular preacher, is Acts of the Spirit, or even the Gospel of the Spirit. And I think that's the Gospel of the Spirit is a more ancient title, actually, that we find. But that highlights the centrality. This eschatological spirit links together the past, the present, and the future. The past is the life history of Jesus, right? He is that past that is now made present in the life of the community, his life, his death, his resurrection. All those things are not locked away in the past. They rather are alive, and they are alive by the power of the Spirit. So that sense of past touching then onto the present, and then, of course, leaning into the future. So the future piece here, right? The long promised gift spoken of by the prophets. The Spirit now bringing healing, forgiveness, empowering for service, right? The Spirit as primary actor, not only in guiding the church, but also empowering them to do certain kinds of things. Certainly the book of Acts contains healing stories and scenes where the power is not attributed specifically to an apostle, but rather to the Spirit at work in and through them. And then lastly, and I think this is very important actually for this text and for our engagement in it, is how much the church itself resists the Spirit. The Spirit is resisted not only by outsiders in the telling of the story, but also by insiders. And some of that is, I think, included as cautionary tale for the church, right? To be open. I don't know if I shared this with you, but the phrasing, the stiff-necked people that you sometimes hear, right, in the Old Testament, that image literally meant that this was a person who couldn't turn their head to consider something different. Right? People so set in their way. And that's sometimes also you encounter in the telling of the story in Acts. And specifically around our second big theme, right? The inclusion of the Gentiles. Right? So this is clearly a key component of the book of Acts. I would say the center of the book from chapter 10 to 15 is wrapped up in this work of bringing in the new and opening doors, right? The Spirit of God, Jesus, hold on for just one second. Story of God, Jesus, the Spirit is all rooted in Israel. It's all a fulfillment of promises made to Israel, and yet the boundaries are expanding. And we see that sort of slowly but surely, that expansion happening. And I think, again, chapter 10 really begins with Cornelius going up to 15, which is sort of the Jerusalem Council event, all of those chapters. And we might even include chapters 8 and 9 as well, because they proceed through the Spirit pushing the church to embrace others in preparation for Cornelius, which is the big leap in a sense. Before I go further, I think there was a question over here. Can we pass the mic? Maybe I should want to figure out what's the best process for this. Thanks, Dave.
No, I just and if this gets us way off track, feel free to ignore my question. But when you said the Spirit is the long promised gift poured out indiscriminately in the last days, is the last days bound by the text, or is the last day something that we're living in and currently? I just was curious how you look at that, or when it says that.
So you want my opinion? Okay. No, I would say I would pretty much operate within that sensibility. I do think most of the texts that we have in the New Testament assume a kind of that they're living in a final time, and what inaugurates that is the resurrection of Jesus, right? So since the resurrection of Jesus, we've been living essentially in what are often called the last days. The book of Acts, of course, is set up with Pentecost right at the very beginning. And I think one of the things that what we see, and I don't know that I recognized this before we really started our study, is that the Spirit is poured out multiple times in the book of Acts. So even Pentecost itself is meant to be a kind of repeatable action. So it does seem to me that there's a kind of indiscriminate pouring out that continues to happen, and that we continue to live in some sense in the last days. Now, I'm not using that in the Hal Lindsey, Tim LaHaye Left Behind sensibility, which I do not agree with that way of talking about the end. I know a lot of people have read that or have been influenced by that. That's not where I'm coming from. But a sense of anticipation, right? It seems to me is one way of thinking about it. So yes, major disagreements within the church. So eschatological spirit, that gift, that in a way, that gift, doing something fundamentally and utterly extraordinary, bringing in the outsider, bringing down the walls of division, walls of separation, which is the terminology that is used in the book of Ephesians, in order to create a new people. Right. And that's what we mean by inclusion of the Gentiles. And that's something that the church continues to this day to struggle with. Otherness, outsider, insider, all those dynamics. And I don't think it doesn't seem to me like there's a very easy solution. It's just a constant negotiation, it seems to me. So, and then the last theme, and I don't know if it's a theme or if it's simply we have to recognize. Hold on for just one second. We need to get the mic over to you. Hold on. I want you to repeat that. Is that on? Is it not working? Maybe we should just leave it on, I guess. Yeah, let's just leave it on from now on. Okay. I have a slight technical difficulty here.
Never mind.
No, go ahead.
Why isn't the solution simple? I mean, why is that a problem? You include everybody.
I don't think it is a problem personally from a theological perspective. I think though the way that we wind, and by we, I mean every church that's ever probably existed, way we wind up working it out on the ground clearly shows that it is not simple, that it fights against some deeper part of us that is afraid of otherness, is afraid of the outsider, is afraid what real inclusion might or might not mean. And so recognizing some of those elements and trying to kind of nurture in a pastoral way to enable, churches and communities to do that kind of work is not straightforward. So that's kind of what I mean. I do think theologically speaking, it's pretty straightforward. Yeah. It's pretty obvious almost. And yet what we see, so if you and I experience this in the life of our church, we're not alone, because the very first communities experienced the issue in a different way, of course, nevertheless, though, the same dynamics at the very beginning, essentially. So that's something that's been there as a kind of part of the life of the church. And it may have simply to do with the nature of human community as well. So, I mean, I guess there's a bunch of different ways we could go with that. So the last theme is that we get little vignettes. And I don't know if this is a theme per se. We could describe this as a theme depending on what we mean, but we get these little vignettes of what the Christian life is beginning to look like on the ground. Now, there's a lot of scholarship around, how reliable is the book of Acts in terms of the way that it's portraying our community, or the early communities or whatnot, et cetera, without kind of setting that out totally aside and recognizing that I'm sure there's some glossing over of things here and there. Nevertheless, we do get windows into the past, right? So the community life is a life shaped by sharing, by solidarity, and by care. Sharing is a very big deal. The right use of possessions is a huge theme in the book of Acts. So economics and religion, economics and the life of the spirit are very definitely entwined in the book of Acts. You'd have to be, I think, decidedly trying to avoid the theme to not see that. And then the Christian life itself is, in some sense, framed by the idea of witness. And I've said this before, I think in another class that I did on the early history of the church, that I think that most Christians in one way or another thought about Christian existence through the lens of witness. What does it mean to be a witness in word and deed? A witness to Jesus, a witness to the truth of his resurrection. And of course, that word is the Greek word for witness is martyr. And so martyrdom and martyrologies become very significant in the 2nd century. And you already have in the book of Acts sort of the first Christian account of a martyrdom with the martyrdom of Stephen. So I think these themes, and so if we were to turn this into more than just the book of Acts gives us a window into the past, a data set, and we said, what is a theme? Well, it's essentially in some ways a kind of discipleship manual. In a way, like here's how the church could organize its life. Here's what it might look like to be a faithful Christian, living in the context with our Jewish neighbors, or living in the context of our Gentile neighbors, or whatever else there is in between, perhaps. So those are our big themes. Let me stop for just a second and see if there are any other good questions, comments, objections. Wow. I'll take it. All right, let's move forward. In prep then to moving into our text, to like a direct or study of the actual text, I thought it would be good to quickly remind you of where we've been because we're going to kind of pick up the story, the threads, and just sort of start moving in as we sometimes do at the beginning of the year. So chapters 1 through 7, and I've kind of grouped these chapters 1 through 7 and 8 through 14. 15, for some people, 15 functions as something of a conclusion. For others, chapter 15 is like a fulcrum. And for others still, like that is that the whole book turns on it. And then for others, chapter 15 is part of a smaller or a, kind of something that belongs to the first half as opposed to the second half. So this is very, very definitely arbitrary. So chapters 1 through 7, though, I think is useful for thinking about the fact that most of the events that are recounted here are events that are happening in and around Jerusalem. We see chapter 2, of course, one of the most significant chapters, probably the most significant chapter, I suppose, in the whole book, and a very important chapter in the New Testament in general, right, which recounts events at Pentecost and the pouring out of the Spirit, which I think oftentimes for many traditions, this is the scene of the birth of the church, is kind of the way that that is often talked about. We have in this first section that really strong emphasis on right use of possessions. We have the very troubling story of Ananias and Sapphira. We have 3 or 4 different vignettes of the early Christian community that speak about essentially a kind of Pentecostal communism where they're sharing their gifts and their possessions with one another. Yeah, I hope that probably startled all of you. Just so you know, that term comes from John Wesley. So that's not me making that up. But this is clearly important. How you live out and how you use your material possessions is somehow also shaped by the Spirit, right? So the Spirit and matter, it's not like one of them has to do with invisible things, and it doesn't have anything to do with the things that we all have to deal with on a day-to-day level. The other thing that we see, typical pattern, the gospel is starting to be heard, embraced, etc. Resistance rises, right? I love to use this little quip from my therapist. So I hope that you'll enjoy this as well. But the winds of change produce the waves of resistance. With the winds of change come waves of resistance. And that's kind of what you see, I think. And you can kind of read through each chapter and you'll see sort of an expansion and then a resistance and expand. And that same thing is starting, that same kind of pattern carries through most of the book of Acts in smaller chunks here and there. And then this section really ends then with the stoning of Stephen and the scattering of the church. And of course, the scattering of the church is a very difficult thing. To go into exile is not a small thing. And any Jew who had any knowledge of the Torah and the stories of the writings knew about exile and knew what kind of a daunting sense that might be. And yet also one of the things that we see is that God very quickly turns the script and begins to use the scattering of the church as an instrument whereby the gospel will spread even further. So we sort of begin to see that, and that starts then to unfold in chapter 8. And so chapters 8 through 14, I think, kind of fit together nicely. And here already in chapter 8, we start to see the spread of the gospel to peoples previously that it would not have been in the imagination necessarily of the typical Jew or the typical Jewish Christian, perhaps, that these also would be addressees of the gospel, at least without them making some significant efforts to change. And so we get sort of this widening concentric circle series of events, little vignettes. Starts out with Philip, a deacon, who never is actually depicted as waiting tables, doing what deacons would have supposedly done. He's actually only ever depicted as preaching. He goes to Samaria, right? And the Samaritans in Samaria, they would have been considered cousins, cousins of the Jews, but also despised, right? Outsiders, people that we have a really major problem with. Its issue. Preaches in Samaria, has a good hearing. Philip also then winds up in one of those very, very interesting encounters with a eunuch from Ethiopia. And Ethiopia, not just that it's in Africa, but it would have been in some ways in the mental sort of cosmography of people, like their way that they imagine how the world was shaped and organized. It would have been sort of the end of the earth. They might have thought about Ethiopia as like on the very edge of the known world. Well, the gospel all of a sudden is going to go there with this person. Then we get one of the enemies, the great enemies of the church, Saul, winds up being transformed, right? And Saul embraces the gospel, etc. And then this ends this kind of process. I should say the beginning of the end really is with Cornelius, right? A God-fearing Gentile, which means someone who was probably involved in synagogue, attended, maybe kept kosher, but had not gone the full final step, which would have included circumcision. So he and his family hear the gospel from Peter, and that encounter is so important that the book of Acts tells us about it twice. We get chapter 10 where the actual event sort of happens, and then Peter in chapter 11 has to go and explain it and retells the entire story to the Jerusalem church in chapter 11. So it's so important it has to be repeated, right? And that's an instructive thing. It tells us that would have been, the reason for that. And you can kind of guess, in a sense, given what we've already talked about in terms of Gentile inclusion. So in addition to that, of course, as the gospel spreads to Gentiles, the church encounters resistance. Some of that they encounter from other Gentiles, and some of it they encounter from other Christians, Jewish Christians. So this is that place where that encounter happens. And then lastly, this set of chapters includes the first journey of Paul and Barnabas. And so a journey that probably lasts 4 years, perhaps more. And they mostly spend their time in Asia Minor, traveling around, preaching the gospel. Sometimes in very interesting spots in their typical practice is to go to the synagogue. So sometimes they will have Jewish converts, but there are 2 or 3 places where they already in this point are only speaking to Gentiles. And you sort of start to see that, and it will unfold even further as we get into the next chapters. This leads us then up to our chapter that we're currently in, chapter 15. And chapter 15 is oftentimes called the Jerusalem Council because all of this work that the Spirit is doing, of including and drawing people in, the church can't catch up fast enough. What does this mean? How do Jews then, how do they affiliate and associate with Gentiles? Because they already have so ingrained in them questions about clean and unclean. They have certain dietary restrictions, et cetera. Are we supposed to simply set all that aside? Well, wait a minute, but that's what makes us Jewish. Those are all the kinds of questions that would be swirling around. And so in some ways, this council, I think, is trying to thread that needle. What does it mean to now become a new reality, a new thing with new people, and yet still be in connection with that which has come before, right? Because Jesus doesn't come to abolish the law or abolish the promises that God makes, but rather to fulfill them. So that's really what this chapter has dealt with. And we have just sort of passed through that material now to the portion where we are in verse 22 of chapter 15. Now, before I transition to that, let me just pause and see if there are any questions or comments, thoughts about where we've been. Jeff?
Well, as I listen to this and I hear your summary of it, I'm just struck by the fact that it seems that Christianity back in these days, as it was taking shape, was more inclusive than our Christianity today. And in that, I mean, you know, we focus on thinking good thoughts and thinking about God in the right way. But they had all these other things they were supposed to do and conform to and share their possessions and everything else. And so it was a more demanding faith in those days than I think than it is today, or at least as we exhibit it today. What do you say to that?
Well, I feel like you asked me two questions, or you made two observations. One is Christianity is more inclusive, and the other as Christianity is more rigorous. And I do think I can answer the second one first. I do think it would be fair to say that the early Christians and the way that they thought about the faith was definitely more rigorous. It cost you more. It was a commitment of a way of life. And then particularly if you know, sort of little bits that we can gather here and there, either from the New Testament or from other early Christian writings, to become a Christian cost you potentially. If you were Jewish, it could cost you connections in your community, maybe connections to your family, etc. And if you're Gentile, and I think we see that also, it could cost you, certainly with the threat of persecution of some type, perhaps. But they also believed very definitely it wasn't primarily, and I think this is maybe where the Jewish background, right? Just to remember that the Christian church, the Christian gatherings are really just basically a subset of the religion of Israel at this point. There's no sort of such thing as Christianity different from Judaism yet. And that Jewish background, and if you know sort of, you know, kind of a sense about the emphasis in Judaism is really on practice in a lot of ways. Certainly modern, there's a wonderful little adage of you need 3 synagogues for 2 Jews, because you need 1 synagogue for each of them in which they can hold their own positions, and 1 in the middle where they can meet. Right. And the idea is that everyone can have an opinion, and that's perfectly fine. But really, when the rubber meets the road, we have to make a decision because we're called to act a certain way. So that emphasis on action is very, very important, I think. So the rigorous element, I think, is right. Inclusion or not, I think, is a different question. It seems to me that we're sort of yes and no, perhaps. Sometimes we're more inclusive, sometimes we're not. Sometimes they were less inclusive, sometimes they were not, etc. So I don't know if it's quite as straightforward for me. Other comments or questions or thoughts? It's really nice to be back up here. I haven't been here in like several months. This is kind of fun. Thank you. Yeah. Well, okay. Well, you guys ready to jump in? I'm going to need a volunteer who's willing to read our opening passage. All right, Elgin, you got it?
Then the apostles and the elders, with the consent of the whole church, decided to choose men from among their members and to send them to Antioch with Paul and Barnabas. They sent Judas, called Barsabas, and Silas, leaders among the brothers, with the following letter. The brothers, both the apostles and the elders, to the believers of Gentile origin in Antioch and Syria and Cilicia, greetings. Since we have heard that certain persons who have gone out from us, though with no instructions from us, have said things to disturb you and have unsettled your minds, we have decided unanimously to choose representatives and send them to you, along with our beloved Barnabas and Paul, who have risked their lives for the sake of our Lord Jesus Christ. We have therefore sent Judas and Silas, who themselves will tell you the same things by word of mouth, for it has seemed good to the Holy Spirit and to us to impose on you no further burden than these essentials: that you abstain from what has been sacrificed to idols, and from blood, and from what is strangled, and from fornication. If you keep yourselves from these, you will do well. Farewell. So they were sent off and went down to Antioch. When they gathered the congregation together, they delivered the letter. When its members read it, they rejoiced at the exhortation. Judas and Silas, who were themselves prophets, said much to encourage and strengthen the believers. After they had been there for some time, they were sent off to peace by the believers in those who had sent them. But Paul and Barnabas remained in Antioch, and there, with many others, they taught and proclaimed the word of the Lord.
Okay. All right. So just to sort of remind us at the very beginning of the chapter and the verses that precede this, certain men, certain people from Jerusalem, the text tells us, make their way to Antioch. And one of the reasons why Antioch, I think, is important in this is that, in all accounts, from what we can certainly gather from the data of the New Testament, et cetera, Antioch really is sort of our first multicultural church. And these Jerusalem folks go there and they say that Jews should not be eating with Gentiles, is essentially what it comes down to. And the issue, particularly on the table, is the issue of circumcision. And one of the ironies in this letter is that circumcision is never actually addressed. So it's like they kind of go past that issue and don't necessarily address it. What we then get here is the decision that the community comes to, because after this, Paul and Barnabas make their way up to Jerusalem. Peter is there, and each of them recounts their story, right? So Peter's going to tell about his ministry with Cornelius, his experience. Paul and Barnabas are going to share about their ventures on the road in Asia Minor, et cetera. And then we come to the sort of point here. And this includes then the letter, essentially, that's going to now go out to other communities wherever essentially there are Christians. And we don't, and I think one of the great things too about the book of Acts is that it doesn't really tell us oftentimes how the Christian message winds up having spread to a certain place. It's just all of a sudden already there. So verses 22 then through 29 recount this decision, and it includes, I think, 2 or 3 things that I thought were important to highlight. The first is that they choose a delegation of people. It's not just up to one person to go forth. It's not just up to Paul or to Peter or Barnabas. It's up to a collection of folks, right? They send out, right, Paul and Barnabas, but also Judas, called Barsabbas, and Silas. And essentially this delegation then is conferred with authority to go forth and on behalf of the Jerusalem community to communicate the contents of the letter. Now, I include here, as I say here, they're chosen to deliver the decision and communicate that Jerusalem wants to be and is in fellowship. And maybe it also will include, I'm just speculating here, an apology, because one of the things that they do say is that these folks who did come from Jerusalem, they did not necessarily represent the Jerusalem church. So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. The letter then recounts kind of what we've already heard earlier in the chapter. And if you remember, I don't know if I shared this with you, but if you want to understand the stipulations, right, of don't eat meat sacrificed to idols, don't affiliate with blood, which would obviously like basically those first three things are very clearly connected to idolatry. And fornication typically is also connected to temple prostitution. So almost all four of those things have some kind of connection to idolatry, and that's why they're included, I think. And I think also, though, this is where understanding that there's already a Jewish debate going on about Gentiles and whether, and I'm talking about a Jewish debate quite apart from the Christian community, of whether or not Gentiles should or can participate in the life of the Jewish community. One of the solutions is to put forward something like what is typically called the Noahic covenant. That is, the covenant that God made with Noah becomes the basis essentially for how Gentiles can now interact with, and that includes some of these stipulations in there. And so why would that be important? Well, God is making a new covenant with all of humanity in the story of Noah. And so it has this kind of Gentile sensibility, this larger world. So I think that's sort of an important, at least small background piece. The other thing that I think is, of course, important here, right, is that this is unanimously decided. This is not simply one faction in the church. It is decided, at least according to this letter. And this is where one of those places actually where the book of Acts does get some criticism from scholars, because you can compare how Paul talks about these events with the book of Acts, and the book of Acts makes it sound so much more pleasant. Paul makes it sound like there were knives out, and after we carved up the pig that we were, or I shouldn't say that, gosh, they wouldn't be carving up a pig. I'm from the South, so I was thinking pigging. That would not be appropriate. After they carved up dinner, they would be trying to carve up one another. I guess that's the image I was going after, but unanimously decided, and specifically, right, so that we don't lose the thread that we've been going with the entire time that we've been in this book. It was good to who? To the Spirit, right? That is, that it is essentially the Spirit is the one who is guiding, who is setting down some of these stipulations. That at least is the way that they configure this. And from the perspective then of the letter, this is not simply an arbitrary experience. It is rather a decision that in some ways mirrors, at least that's the way that the text of Acts, it mirrors what God has already been doing. God has already been pulling Gentiles into fellowship with God's people, right? With Cornelius, with the other encounters that are happening in other places. And there's little tidbits here and there in the city of Antioch as well. So it's the Spirit who's doing that work. And now the idea essentially is the Spirit is the one coming up with a way to regulate some of this. There are issues here that are more complicated and complex. And so we're going to regulate this in a certain kind of way. And we think that this is a Spirit-led way essentially to regulate that. That at least is the way that the text kind of configures this. So then in verses 30 through 35, so they went off, they were sent off and went down to Antioch, right? So they're returning then in some ways to the scene that started all of this, and to that church that really is the first kind of multicultural church, at least as insofar as if the New Testament is concerned. When they gathered the congregation together, they delivered the letter. When its members read it, they rejoiced at the exhortation. Judas and Silas, who were themselves prophets, said much to encourage and strengthen the believers. After they had been there for some time, they were sent off in peace by the believers to those who had sent them. But Paul and Barnabas remained in Antioch, and there with many others they taught and proclaimed the word of the Lord. So pretty straightforward, right? Go to Antioch, the place where this whole fight broke out, but also in some ways the site of this experiment. deliver the letter with these regulations, a way to regulate things, these stipulations. And as I mentioned here, delivered the letter does have a kind of technical meaning in Greek. This would have been a somewhat formal event, and not just folks gathering around the fire to hear Grandpa's letter. Then we get a little bit on Judas and Silas. Excuse me. So in the back of my throat here. And that is followed up then with additional exhortation and preaching. This may or may not be important, but Paul and Barnabas are obviously pro Gentile inclusion. We already know that. We don't necessarily know as much about Judas and Silas. So the fact that we hear that they are encouraging, right, that they're speaking in a way that gives us a sense that they, in some sense, are the mouthpiece, perhaps, for Jerusalem, the Jerusalem church. And then when they are sent away, when they leave in peace, right? They leave with the full blessing and the sense of fellowship that everyone had hoped for, right? After having stayed for some time to deepen their fellowship. All right, let me stop just for a second and see what kind of comments, questions, thoughts that folks might have. Do we have any comments or questions from our friends online? No. Can we pass the mic over? It should be on, right? Oh, it wasn't. You turned it off. Okay. Hey, Matt, can you help us out? So you wanted to clarify, yeah, all four of them go to Antioch.
Because later then Paul chooses Silas, so.
Well, then Silas and Judas return to Jerusalem, and Paul and Barnabas remain in Antioch. So it could have been a different Silas as well than the one that we hear about him choosing in just a minute. Other comments, questions, thoughts? This is good for me because then I get to take a breath. You don't have to turn it off. All right, let's turn then to our next text. Can I get a volunteer who will read this passage for us? Dave, will you read the passage?
Well, we're starting with 36.
Yeah, 36 through 41. That's right.
After some days, Paul said to Barnabas, "Come, let us return and visit the believers in every city where we proclaim the word of the Lord and how they are doing." Barnabas wanted to take with them John called Mark, but Paul decided not to take with them one who had deserted them in Pamphylia and had not accomplished them in their work. The disagreement became so sharp that they parted company. Barnabas and Mark with him sailed away into Cyprus. But Paul chose Silas and set out the believers, commending him to the grace of the Lord. He went through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right. So essentially, I mean, this is kind of a straightforward passage, right? It does tell us a couple of things. One is, I suppose, the way that Paul and Barnabas thought about their relationship to the churches or the communities that they had encountered, some of whom they had perhaps founded, others of which they had simply encouraged, that they wanted to stay in connection with these folks, right? And that's one of the things that we see. And this is something that has struck me personally as I've been reading through, because oftentimes we hear about quote unquote Paul's missionary journeys, but Paul is not necessarily functioning in the way that we would talk about a missionary, right? He's literally driven out to go and encounter. Sometimes he encounters communities that are already there, and he upbuilds those communities. And now the rationale to go back is not to necessarily preach, in new settings per se, but rather to encourage and strengthen the communities that are already there. So it's kind of an interesting, I don't know, nuance. I'm not really sure myself what to do per se with that, but clearly, right, Paul wants to return and check in on these different communities. And then we get this very interesting, we get this unfortunate moment here, right? This argument between Paul and Barnabas. And like I said before, if there is any truth, that there's any shred of truth, that Paul's letter to the Galatians gives us a clearer picture of what actually happened in Antioch, the fact that Acts includes an argument, it must have been a really bad one. Right? Because if Acts kind of sort of smooths things over a little bit, here clearly the author was not able to smooth it out totally. And it has to do with the status of this figure, John Mark. We've encountered him very briefly. He's a companion of Paul and Barnabas during their first journey, and he abandons them at a certain point in Pamphylia, as the text tells us. It doesn't tell us why he abandons them. And of course, later on, John Mark will become a companion of Paul. So there is a kind of, they come back together, they reconcile, etc. So that's, just keep that in mind. But we don't quite know why John Mark leaves. It's clear, though, that his leaving was problematic, and that's what we know this now, because the language of abandonment is not used in the earlier story. Now we get to hear that. There is a theory. It's one of, it's a theory, so it's not set in stone, that the use of the grammar here that talks about abandonment, it seems to indicate that it wasn't just that John Mark didn't like sleeping outdoors because he was rolling around on rocks and it hurt, and that's why he left. It's because potentially he did not agree with the Gentile mission. And so that's one of the theories that's put out there as perhaps what happened, but we don't know. As I say here, the grammar might suggest that he wasn't in favor of the Gentile mission. Whatever the case, Paul and Barnabas cannot reconcile over John Mark's status, whether he should come, whether he can be trusted or not. And so they have a falling out. And I think it's hard to wrap your head on a certain level around this and not come away with thinking that Paul was just really a hard ass. I don't know how else to say it, because Barnabas is consistently portrayed as a son of encouragement, a friend. He's the one who introduces Paul to the Jerusalem elders when they won't talk to him, etc. So his nature seems to be very, very congenial. And for him to have a falling out with Paul, it's hard to walk away not thinking that Paul is the harsher one potentially. But we don't really know. We just know that there's clearly a falling out. Can we send that forward for a question? For hard ass? Yeah. Sorry. I was like registering. Can I say that in the Bible study? I think I can. Yeah.
I was just going to ask, did John Mark write the Gospel of Mark?
Well, I don't know. There is some speculation, typically the typical way that you hear about the author of Mark is that they are connected somehow to Peter. And that the Gospel of Mark represents in some ways, especially a Petrine or a Peter perspective. But I haven't really gone back into that material to know well enough, but I'm assuming that this John Mark is a player as an option in that catalog of people who might have written that gospel. So that's a good question. I just don't know the answer to it.
That was aborted versus when the gospel.
No, you need to use the mic.
So what are we talking about time-wise between this trip where the argument happened and the writing of the Gospel of Mark?
So I think most of the events here, insofar as we can date them, put it in the 50s. In fact, there's one that's coming up in a little while where we can get a pretty precise date around 53 AD. And typically the Gospel of Mark is understood to have been written in the 60s or 70s, depending, of course, on. So it's very, very close to the destruction of the temple. For some people, it's after the destruction. For others, it's just before. So it's about at least a decade, maybe more, removed. But it's close. Yeah, it's not too far away. That's right. So Paul and Barnabas have a falling out. We don't get all the details, but again, reading between the lines, and I won't repeat myself. And then Barnabas goes one direction. He goes the direction initially that Paul and Barnabas originally set off, because the first place that they went to was Cyprus. So he goes in that direction. And if you remember, that is Barnabas's home. So he heads to kind of his home turf to check on the communities there. And then Paul goes a different direction on his journey. This whole episode, though, to me, is one that we can kind of line up with a few other episodes that we've already had, and I'm sure more that we will encounter as we move through, of the kind of human character of the early community. And so we don't necessarily we're not necessarily getting a thoroughly whitewashed view of the early church where everyone just walks on water. And I have so many other analogies I could use, but I know they're all inappropriate. So then in verses 40 through 41, we get the story of Paul heading in a slightly different direction. So he kind of makes his way northwest up into Syria, and then eventually will be into Asia Minor. Okay, I think we have here. I think let's do one more passage and then we'll transition into our concluding time together. It should be, yeah.
Okay. Is that on?
Should be.
Okay.
I think hold it a little closer to your.
Okay. Paul went on also to Derbe and to Lystra, where there was a disciple named Timothy, the son of a Jewish woman who was a believer, but his father was a Greek. He was well spoken of by the brothers and sisters of Lystra and Iconium, and Paul wanted Timothy to accompany him, and he took him and had him circumcised because of the Jews who were in those places, for they all knew that his father was a Greek. As they went from town to town, they delivered to them for observance the decisions that had been reached by the apostles and elders who were in Jerusalem. So the churches were strengthened in the faith and increased in numbers daily. They went through the region of Phrygia and Galatia, having been forbidden by the Holy Spirit to speak the word in Asia. When they had come opposite Mysia, they attempted to go into Bithynia, but the Spirit of Jesus did not allow them. So bypassing by Mysia, they went down to Troas. And during the night, Paul had a vision. There stood a man of Macedonia, pleading with him and saying, "Come over to Macedonia and help us." When he had seen the vision, we immediately tried to cross over to Macedonia, being convinced that God had called us to proclaim the good news to them.
I think this is probably the one time when I have been here in like over the decade or so teaching where I'm actually going to comment on the passage that was preached on this Sunday. I can't remember another time that's happened. So, okay. So now essentially, I think the first thing to note, and I don't really have a comment here, but we really do now just the narrative really does now become a Paul-centric narrative. Notwithstanding everything that we've said about the primary actor and agent being God and the Spirit, what we wind up following, the plot line, is how God is working in and through Paul and Paul's companions. So that becomes the story. That doesn't mean that there aren't other things going on, right? And that's one of the great things. Every now and then, Paul will come upon a community of believers, and he doesn't have, the text doesn't tell us, and we don't have any idea how they got there, but there they are. So that's an important thing, I think, to note. And I also think in the popular imagination of folks who maybe think at all about Acts, they think, oh, this is a story about Paul. And typically it's because here, basically around the middle of the book, it really does start to follow his story. All right. So verses 1-3. So Paul goes on to Derbe and Lystra, where there was a disciple named Timothy, the son of a Jewish woman who was a believer, but his father was a Greek. He was well spoken of by the brothers and sisters in Lystra and Iconium. Paul wanted Timothy to accompany him, and he took him and had him circumcised because of the Jews who were in those places, for they all knew that his father was a Greek. Now, as I say here, this passage raises a host of questions that are not easily answered. I think it would be fair to say. We also, of course, are now being introduced to one of the really, really important companions of Paul. And there are two letters that bear his name. Certainly, I think First Timothy is probably written by Paul. Second Timothy may or may not, but a very, very important figure. One of the things that I think is very important before we sort of engage the central question of these verses, which is, why did Paul have Timothy circumcised, is simply to note Timothy's own status, right? Timothy himself is caught in what is typically called a liminal status. He's an in-between person. He is mestizo or Creole is another way that the language, certainly in the racialized imagination in North America. So an in-between status, his very body, in a sense, embodies the complexity that the communities have already encountered and that they are encountering, right? Because he is of Jewish and Gentile parentage. His mother is Jewish, his father is Greek. It is not clear when the Jewish community began to adhere to a matrilineal identification. I mean, that certainly is probably the case by the 4th or 5th century AD, but at this point, it's not entirely clear. So it doesn't necessarily resolve our questions about, is he Jewish or not, to say, well, his mom's Jewish, so yeah, because we don't know if that's actually what most Jews believed at that time. Later on, they do come to believe that. So in his very person, he is a complex figure, right? His body is a complex artifact, essentially. The other thing that is really important is, as I mentioned, when the initial brouhaha breaks out in the city of Antioch, it's primarily about circumcision. And then the council gets together and meets, and they have nothing to say about circumcision in their letter, right? That letter did not address the issue of circumcision. It certainly did not say that you needed to be circumcised. But here now it shows up again, and circumcision was, I think, probably one of the most, it's either Sabbath or circumcision is the most important command for a Jew. And in some cases, you can pause or kind of break Sabbath laws to circumcise. So circumcision as an identifying marker seems to have held even higher of a place than even Sabbath. And so, and Sabbath, keeping Sabbath would have been really the most important, at least in terms of kind of arguments that you have among Jewish scholars in terms of the laws that they kept. So it shows up now and reappears. So the central question then, why does Paul have Timothy circumcised? I'm going to answer this question so good. I'm just kidding. I have run across, you really can run across, I think, several different interpretive options. I'm going to kind of offer these to you in some sense, feeling that these don't have to be mutually exclusive. There could be, I think, and there probably were many reasons, it seems to me. And I would hope that there would be many reasons, because circumcision sounds very painful. So you better have more than one reason. It would seem to be. That's supposed to be a joke, but none of you laughed. I thought you would. Thank you. Yes. So I think to me, the easiest answer that comes out of the grain of the text itself is that this is a tactical decision, right? That this is a tactic that Paul engages in to make Timothy an acceptable companion, essentially. Paul knows that he's going to be visiting Jewish Christian communities, and he's going to know their alacrity, their sense of commitment or whatever to the law. And so perhaps he assesses that and he decides, in order for the gospel to continue to have a hearing, I need to do everything I can to remove any possible blockage. And this would be potentially one of those things. Gosh, is such a joke right there. It is so right there, but I'm not saying it. Yes. Thank you. I'm glad at least one person saw that. All right. The second one, I think, that also fits within the bigger, not just this story, but the bigger arc of Acts, is that when we get towards the end and Paul returns to Jerusalem and he gets arrested, one of the things he's accused of is preaching to the Jewish people to forget the ways of Moses. So here he is shown keeping one of the key, if not the key, most important practice, right? So he himself is still a faithful Jew, is kind of the idea, right? So Paul is not guilty then of this accusation that will repeat itself in several places, particularly in the Jerusalem context, that he teaches people to disregard Moses. The last one is one that I think is more theoretical in a way. It's less straightforward, but I think there's something worth sitting with. And that is what I say here, that this becomes Timothy's body, because it's a complex body, becomes a theological symbol, right? He is both Jew and Gentile together in his person. And the fact then, as I mentioned, that even someone whom other Jews would not have known as purely Jewish, because they would not, there would have been serious questions about his status. So circumcision might remove some of those, but there would still be like, well, his dad's Greek, so that's why he eats that stuff or does those things or makes those jokes. Nevertheless, in his flesh, he can still be someone who bears the promises to Israel, right? He becomes then, in a way, an emblem of the impossible thing that God is now doing, which is drawing Gentiles into the church. Now, this is not a straightforward argument, in part because he's been circumcised, which seems to move against some of what we hear in other places in the book of Acts. But this, I think, is worth like that we want, I think this act is so important that it's worth more than just a historical, tactical reason. There might be something theologically important about what is happening here in terms of Timothy. And therefore, this is an option at least to consider. Verses 4-5, then moving forward, after we hear about this action, essentially outlines for us the objectives that Paul has for his journey. One of which, and they don't surprise us, right, to deliver the verdict of the council. And the second then is to strengthen the churches. And I think given, in some ways, like that first reason actually reinforces the importance of option number one for why Paul went about doing this. Because it's not clear, would the Jewish Christians in these other areas have wanted Gentiles to enter into their space or not? How did they think about that? We just don't know, et cetera. So very interesting. We then get, what time is it? 11:20. I'm already going to go overtime first day. Christian. I know, I am consistent. That's right. The last thing is that I just wanted to make an observation here. I don't have a ton more to offer than perhaps what you heard on Sunday with this vision of the Macedonian man. But there are two things that seems to me that are important in these verses. One is a reassertion of divine agency. We've heard a lot preceding this about human agency, right? This argument between Paul and Barnabas. They are the ones that want to go out and check on the churches. Paul, it says, is the one who takes Timothy to have him circumcised, et cetera, et cetera. And then all of a sudden, the Spirit comes back on in a very, very strong way, in fact, right? It is the Spirit that says, you are not going to preach over here, you're going to preach over there, or you're going to share the gospel over there. So the passage kind of refocuses us on the central agent of the story. And we're not given any real reason, which I think is an interesting thing. We're not told why the Spirit said don't go over here versus go over there, as I mentioned here. And we don't really necessarily even know how they discerned that until, of course, we get the vision itself, perhaps. Then we do get the vision. And there really are kind of two things that I wanted to highlight here. One is that the vision resolves the closed doors and opens up a different pathway into a different region. And it means leaving Asia and entering into Europe. But very interesting, right? That the gospel has already gone to Africa and Asia and significant portions of Asia. And then finally, it lastly comes to Europe. And usually in kind of the way that we've thought about Christianity is it's somehow a European thing. Not really. It's actually an Asian thing. I think one of the things that's most intriguing actually about this vision is that a man from Macedonia appears and says, come over and help us. And as you will see, the story that follows is that Paul does not meet a man from Macedonia. He meets women from the region, in particular, a woman named Lydia. And Lydia comes from a town that's not actually even in Macedonia. So Paul just kind of is being instructed to go, in a sense, to a certain place and make himself available to whatever it is that's going to happen there, it seems to me. So we will stop. I'm going to stop with that and invite, I think Dave is going to come up and help me out here. Yeah, I can take some questions here at the end.
Did I hear you correctly? You said that Paul, it says here, there stood a man. Now you're saying that there was a woman also, but that's not in the text.
No, when he finally goes over,
Oh, when he goes to mass. okay.
yeah,
I got you.
the person that we
Thank
hear
you.
about, is Lydia.
Okay, gotcha.
And so that's kind of the irony of the story of the vision in a way. Is he essentially, I think, is being asked to put himself in a posture of service, even though the particulars of what that's going to look like are not, they don't work out perhaps the way that he thought, we might say. Other comments or questions? Now, usually I would have a question at the end, and I did have a great one. It's a softball. I was like, what do you want? What are you excited about for this year? But I think what I'd like to also do is to reinstitute one of the things that we used to do at the end of our time, which was to share any prayer requests that we might have, and then to briefly pray for one another as we close up together. So Dave's going to come up and kind of field that, and then I'll rejoin you in just a sec.
Some of you may not know me. My name's Dave. I'm one of the community members here at Meeting House. Just so you're wondering, who's this guy standing up with the t-shirt that says "Do Good"? It's just good to be together. Yeah, Christian invited me as I came into the room, so I didn't come prepared in any way to do this, but thought I would spontaneously jump in because my shirt says "Do Good," so I guess I needed to. It was sort of thematic. Can't go against your shirt, right? But I'd like to invite us to share some prayer requests, whatever you've been carrying this day as you came in, this past week that you've experienced. It could be specific to something that's going on within Meeting House under the Say Yes theme. It could just be worries, concerns that you're carrying for yourself or others in your relational spheres. Does anybody have anything they'd like to share that we could pray around and or for this morning together?
I have Thanksgiving.
Thanksgiving.
I have Thanksgiving. 2 nights ago, I was in bed and at 1:30 in the morning, a 3-foot by 4-foot watercolor painting covered in glass crashed off of the wall on top of my body,
Oh my goodness.
and my elbow went through the glass and was cut. And for some reason, I stayed perfectly still and didn't move. And I just reached some fingers out and I found shard after shard. It had splintered in almost 40 pieces, 1 foot long shards, 1 inch wide, completely covering all my covers and all my pillow and whatever. And it weighs about 30 to 40 pounds. And I didn't hit my head. I didn't hit my face. I didn't get cut. I was bleeding, but nothing. And I just am thanking God that I survived that and that absolutely nothing happened. It was like a guardian angel. When you see the picture with my head is here and I had to crawl out through all these shards. And I was up from 1:30 in the morning till 4, cleaning and picking up and vacuuming and trying to straighten my bed and linens and get them all washed and whatever. So that's a praise.
All right.
You didn't call anybody? You didn't need to?
No, I didn't. Once I staunched the bleeding on my elbow, it was like, I'm going to be good to go.
Remind me of your name again.
Linda.
Linda.
Hendrickson.
Thanks,
Yeah,
Linda. Thanks for
so
sharing
I
that.
just like amazed.
Wow, that is guardian.
Yeah, appreciate that. Of Susie Holderness.
Oh, sorry.
Sit down after walking around all that time. It's hard to get back up. I got word last night that one of my friends died in his sleep. From I haven't, his name is Mark Janisek, and I haven't seen Mark in probably close to 20 years or so. So it's been a long time since I've seen him, but he and his wife always had sort of a special place in my wife and I's heart. I knew them when we were in seminary out in Boston, and so we heard that he died of a heart attack last night.
Sorry you
So
received that news.
Yeah, we would like to really pray for his family, his
Yeah.
wife, Rachel, and he has 2 daughters. And Rachel lost her father when she was probably in her teens. So there's going to be all kinds of complicated things happening here. So they live just outside, they live in Canada, just outside of Niagara Falls. Yeah.
Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah.
It's tender stuff. Very tender stuff. Does anybody have anything else they'd like to offer? All right, then I'm going to offer up a prayer, and then I'll turn it back over to Christian. Gracious Lord, Spirit, Heavenly Partner in our lives, I just come before you and thank you for this time that we have spent together. I thank you for Christian leading and sharing of his knowledge and of his life and of his time. May you continue to strengthen and hold his family up in tenderness as they continue to walk through their own grief. I also just pray for his friend Mark, who passed away, that his family be comforted. Pray for Rachel and their children. It's an unimaginable loss. May your gentleness surround them. May friends come alongside them. May your spirit uphold them. I thank you for the healing of Susie Holderness and the gratefulness we have of how your spirit works and the mystery of how your spirit works. But I offer praise for that. I thank you that Linda was kept safe in this incident of things falling around her. In our lives, things fall around us, Lord. And I just ask that you hold us each tenderly so that we may walk forward in your grace and in your mercy. I thank you for this community. I thank you for the opportunity to say yes to being here, to being together, to yes to your word as we receive it and learn from it and are encouraged and challenged by it. I thank you for this time. May you continue to grace us this day in our comings and goings. It's in Jesus' name I pray. Amen.
All right. Thanks so much, Dave. So we'll look forward to seeing all of you, I hope, and many more next week. And obviously, as always, feel free to invite friends and anyone else. We'll be back in this room. I want to remind you, we have a class this week on Wednesday night on congregationalism. It's going to be a short 3-week little class. And we'll talk a little bit about the history this week. And then next Sunday, I start a class on hospitality and the Lord's Supper. So that'll be after worship on Sundays. Also will be held in this room. So with that, I bid you farewell and God's blessing. Thank you. I do too. I think this feels better.
Yep. It's our living room. Yeah, this is such a better room. Oh. So I'm stiff.